We are so pumped to have this guest on our show today,
Like happy dance, pee your pants pumped.
but I didn't actually pee my pants.
Oh, that's good. It happens from time to time.
But we definitely were geeking out a lot and trying to keep our cool and act cool the whole time we interview this guest. Today we have Joshua Harris on the show. In a time where everyone is living their life in fear of being next on the chopping block in our current culture, Joshua Harris essentially stood up in front of the church and in front of the world and said, "Cancel me."
Joshua's book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, sold over 1 million copies and at one time was seen as sacrosanct in the Christian church. It was popular in the 90s when we were coming of age. And the message was really wait until marriage to kiss. And it was about courtship. And one of the things he's said before that makes it understandable as to why he would have written the book is if we have to wait until marriage to have sex and we have sex when we're dating, we just shouldn't date. And so that was really the thought behind the book. His book now has received a lot of criticism, but when the safest choice would have been to quietly wait for the wave of criticism to pass over, Joshua faced the impact of his book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, head on, and publicly and humbly explored the backdraft that erupted nearly 20 years later in his documentary, I Survived, I Kiss Dating Goodbye. Ultimately, he took his book, I Kiss Dating Goodbye, out of publication and has since issued multiple apologies and is really trying to change the conversation about sex in the future.
Josh is now a certified story brand guide, and his team at Clear and Loud builds websites and crafts marketing content for aspiring brands. You can find him at joshharris.com.
We hope you enjoy the interview.
We had mentioned to you that we're products of the True Love Waits movement, as I think you would identify with as well, or at least like the purity. We actually were a little bit too young for your book to resonate. And so you can rest easy that none of the issues that we have came directly from your book. So hopefully that
is a relief.
helps
Thank you.
a little bit. But, you were a 21-year-old guy, really just almost a kid. And seemingly overnight, you became sort of the face of that purity movement in the church, whether you really wanted it or not. And, with that, your book really kind of promoted courting, not kissing until your wedding day, remaining pure so that your future spouse doesn't have like that video that you showed that you recreated in the documentary with the ghosts of girlfriends past and everybody kind of showing up on the wedding day. And you've had to relive that quite a bit. But if you could rewind time, knowing that your book would still be a hit, that it would still have the same impact that your original book had, and sway the culture of the church one way or the other, what book would? This is a hard question, I know, but what book would you write?
Is terrible.
It's so mean.
Yeah. Well, the thing about it is that the reason the book spread so far and so fast and had such a big impact is because of its extremes. And so it's so impossible for me to imagine the kind of balanced, nuanced, careful type of book having the same kind of, I think a few people would have read it, but we wouldn't be thinking about it. We wouldn't be talking about it. Probably would have sold about 2,000 copies. And, things would have moved on because there were books like that out there already at the time. And so that's sort of the sad reality about the way the world works, the way that different ideas catch on. My idea of I Kiss Dating Goodbye was sticky, and it was compelling partly because it was so imbalanced. It was so idealistic. It was so, it's so played on, I think, tendencies in the community that I was in, where, the most like kind of extreme person sort of takes hold of the mic, because nobody wants to be the person that's like, hey, let's tone down that purity talk, or we don't need to pray that much, or, we don't need to, it's the person that's like, we can do more, we should be doing more, we can try harder for God. That person is hard to argue with unless you're willing to really engage in kind of careful analysis. So yeah, I wish I'd written a very different book. I probably would say not write any book at all would have been better for me at the time. But I don't obviously I don't have the luxury of being able to time travel and do that over.
Sure. You talked about this idea of having these careful, thoughtful conversations that don't often get a lot of press, but that really are the important conversations we need to be having as a society. Why do you think sex in particular and sexuality is so difficult as a society as a whole, specifically in the church? Why do you think that conversation is so difficult and feels like it feels threatening in some ways, especially when we talk about it in a religious context, I think, or in a church, it feels threatening. Why is that? What do you think is behind that?
Well, I think in fairness to a lot of church communities, if you and there's such a wide range of beliefs when it comes to these things. So whatever I say will be too general, or won't apply to everyone. But if you believe that there are decisions and choices you can make that can have eternal consequence for your soul, especially around the topic of sex, where the Bible talks about when you're joined to someone sexually, there's something spiritual that takes place because sex is such an important part of the union of marriage, the oneness of a husband and wife, which is a picture of Christ and the church, and because children come out of that, and that relates to the family, and the family is kind of this basic building block of society and all those types of things. There is a massive impulse to try to control that and try to keep wild sexual impulses from taking over, and so that inevitably takes on a strength that you don't find around other topics, and it also ends up taking on a societal implication, a political implication. So when I was growing up, I didn't understand this at the time, but when I was 19 and I flew out to Washington, D.C., and there was this massive True Love Waits, stakeout where all of those promise cards were on the Washington Mall, that moment was being shaped by political initiative, by churches that were so concerned about teen pregnancy, which was tied into politics around abortion, which was tied into concerns related to sexually transmitted, diseases. AIDS at the time was a big deal. All those different things. All of that was swirling around, and that meant that the conversation couldn't be as just open, real, and individual. It became part of this bigger dialogue and this bigger fight that was taking place. And unfortunately, that played into, I think, more forceful rhetoric.
Now we know. And I think you've said this before too, that it's appealing because this purity movement, like for us with True Love Waits, it was like, say the pledge, make a promise, sign the card, and put a ring on your finger. And that ring acted as some magic shield to protect your purity or something. But I can see why it was so appealing, because as a mom now, I'm doing this and I still don't want to face the hard things. Like my kids are 10, 8, 6, and 3. And I want to imagine them being sweet and little and innocent forever and ever, right? So I get if somebody came to our parents and said, all they have to do is sign a card and wear this ring, and you don't ever have to talk about the hard things, why that would be appealing. And I think that we could easily make the same mistake had we not already experienced that ourselves the first time around and said, this doesn't work. This causes shame and guilt, and, not talking about it just isn't the answer. And so we have that benefit of hindsight being 2020, right?
And literally it doesn't work. Like pregnancy rates went up, not down. STI went up, not down. So it just didn't work mechanically either.
That's a great point. And I think too, there are different types of conversations. There are conversations that's just a monologue from a parent to a child, where the concern is control and behavior, very specific behavior. That's not actually a conversation that's helping your child learn to think for themselves, learn to figure out what they want, learn to figure out, that they can decide what they do with their body sexually and those types of things. Real conversation with any human, let alone your kids, takes a listening, it takes it takes listening, and it takes the ability to honor that other person's different perspective and experience and so on. And that's a hard shift to make as a parent, to actually say, my child doesn't want the same things that I want. My child is going to experience different things than me. My child is going to experience pain, because of different decisions that they make. But I think that ultimately that kind of relationship is what leads to healthier adults.
Absolutely. That's what we set out to do. So we have, we've said many times that asking parents to have these conversations and talking to their kids about sex, right now the answer, and we're talking church, like big C church, right? But in the church, they're saying, well, I think there's just been silence for about 20 years. And so when we've talked to pastors and we say, how are we going to do this? How are we going to help, this next generation that's coming up? And they're like, well, we expect the parents to do it. But most of us in the, I guess, Southern Baptist loop that grew up that way, it wasn't modeled for us. And so when I tell somebody, I've never go to somebody and say, well, you should talk to your kids about sex, because we never learned that language. And so it's like, I always say, it's like, hey, you should teach your kid Mandarin. Well, I don't speak Mandarin. I don't speak this language. So I don't even know how to talk to my kids about this. It's like impossible. And so we've actually created literally, animated videos with conversations, these little 1-minute short casual conversation with kids to model what that looks like and how easy it can be. And that it's not this big, scary thing that we've, made it out to be. But I digress. So
you guys are like Duolingo for having sex talks with your kids.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Yes. We're like, in 2 months, you'll be able to do this really well and be the expert.
That's awesome.
But, the reality is that we know now from research that I sometimes want to kind of hide my eyes from, but the reality is that 95% of people have sex before they're married. And that was even true like back in the 40s.
People who were born in the 40s, it was 91%.
Right. So it's not this heathen culture that people think, that's why so many people have sex. But, it's just something that happens. And I think more and more as we get older, people are getting married later and things like that. But, there's the ideal of what I want for my kids. And then there's the reality. And I want to prepare for them. I would imagine that you had a similar switch raising kids yourself, that, you had written this book. You said you were like, well, I wrote the book, so I have to do it in my own marriage. I'm not going to kiss until my wedding day because I literally wrote the book. But then when your kids were growing up, and probably even when they were younger, you probably had that realization of, I want them to be prepared. I want them to be equipped to be able to make choices and give and receive consent and minimize the pain that they're going to experience, not less the worry of like, how's it going to make our family look if this or this happens, right? So tell us about that shift that you had having little ones and then teenagers later on.
Well, I think it's so interesting that you point out the kind of cultural pressure that's around you that has nothing to do with what is actually best for your kids. It has everything to do with the image that you're projecting as a family, And so I think for a lot of parents in whatever community, it can be a church community, or it can just be kind of a conservative community, or any context where other parents are going to judge you as a bad parent if your child is acting out, which, let's be honest, is normally targeted towards women.
Yeah.
I mean, towards girls.
Yeah.
It's not, oh, your son wore a pair of shorts that were kind of short. It's always, it's always targeting, girls. And so that concern, I think, can create the energy that parents bring to their kids. And your kids feel that. Your kids feel that when you are talking to them, and it's not really about them. It's really about you and your reputation. You don't want to deal with the consequence of them messing up, that kind of thing. So, I mean, that was really hard for me as a pastor. I definitely, in the last 5 years of being a pastor, as my kids were getting older, I was feeling that tension of realizing I don't want to be forceful with them, be strict with them, lay all these rules on them when it's really just about me, keeping my job or saving face in
Yeah.
the eyes of other people. I hate that thought. That's something that I just despise the thought of. But I was definitely in that world. And I think that earlier on, I could have had more and better conversations with them if I had felt more of that freedom. So at the moment that I transitioned from being a pastor to moving across the continent, moving to Vancouver, BC, becoming a graduate student, and so on, was actually a really important timing for my kids. And even though that's been a really hard time for our family, and there's been a ton of upheaval, and my wife and I ended our marriage, and all those types of things, which are very difficult. My wife and I both look back and we're grateful that our kids were able to grow up outside of the kind of pressure and intense focus of being not only the pastor's kids, but the kids of Josh Harris, who wrote I Kissed Dating Goodbye. So my kids never read those books. Like I didn't ever, push that on them. I mean, I think they found a copy and my son started reading it. And he particularly he only focused on one story where I made out with three girls. He's like, "Oh, I love this part." And I'm just like, okay. He had a totally different takeaway from the book than he was supposed to.
Great. I can
but I
make
was
out
fine
with
with
three
that,
girls.
actually.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, he was like, it was now a goal, something to beat, which is not obviously my intention in writing that. But we were able to, in that time, have such honest and open conversations, and they were being exposed to so much in the public school system here in Vancouver. And I mean, I'm amazed at the kind of conversations that we have, the openness. Sometimes I wish they were a little less open with me, honestly, with the things that they say. But I'm grateful that they feel the freedom. And they also were watching me reevaluate my book, So the whole process with the documentary that Jessica Van Der Wyngaard directed and produced, I Survived, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. They were watching that unfold and hearing those conversations. And so I think they benefited from the thought process that was unfolding and being able to say, oh yeah, we did hear those messages and we did see that, but now we're seeing this other side to it. And my goal was not to kind of, shift over to this other place where, okay, kids go out and, do all these things
Sure.
sexually. It
Right.
was more just to say, you need to be aware that there can be pain and heartache in whatever path you choose. And so let's think about, the potential consequences or impact and so on. And I think the big difference was this mindset of you're going to grow and learn through different experiences, and you don't need to be so terrified of doing things perfectly right.
Yeah. That's so powerful. I mean, the documentary itself was so amazing because you really could have just looked the other way and said, "Okay, I don't really feel this way and this isn't how I'm teaching my kids, but I don't want to deal with that and I don't want to deal with the backlash." And, you could have
Mm.
just kind of stayed quiet and it probably would have gone away. But to watch you go through that process with such humility and just listening. I mean, that's what you really did. You listened to what people were saying without judgment and just in complete humility. And I was in all of that because I don't know if I could do that. And it also inspired us to say, we don't know everything and we're not going to start this course with this mentality that we have all the answers and we've honed our expertise and we've done our research and we've done our due diligence and we're doing the very best we can with what we have, but we're not going to say, we have all the answers and this is, going to be perfect, because that's not true, you know?
Well, and it's not true that we would never know exactly what's right for every parent or every child, right? What you said, that children are going to make their own decisions.
That's so
and
true.
families have their own values and what they communicate as important to them. And there's not one person in this world who would be able to say, but this is the thing
Mhm.
that you should do, because it's just not, it's not that simple.
Well, I'm so glad that you're saying that, because I do think that search for a formula that, if you follow, will deliver a certain result. So many parents, especially when their kids are young and they want to do everything right, they're so susceptible to that false promise. And, you can sell a lot to people that are vulnerable like that. You can sell them books, you can sell them conferences, you can sell them resources, and they just want to feel safe. And they just want someone to tell them, do this and say this and make this rule. And then your child will turn out like my child,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that's what, I saw that in the homeschool movement. I was kind of, exhibit A in that world
Mm.
of homeschooling. And then in writing I Kiss Dating Goodbye, I kind of put myself forward as, here's this pure young man that is doing it this. And so many parents kind of pushed that on their kids and said, here's this guy. It's working out great for him and that kind of thing. And it's so damaging because, what you said is so true, Shannon. Like every family is going to be different. Even children in the same family are going to be different. Parents can do one thing with one child and think it worked when actually it just was that it was the right fit with that child's personality,
Mm-hmm.
And the timing of what that child a different child experiences can be radically different. And so letting go of that desire for this perfect safety and security that, because we're going to do things this way, things will turn out in such and such a way is such an important thing to do because it will take off so much pressure.
Yeah. So I think the answer is it's messy and it's not always pretty and it's going to be ugly sometimes, but we're
Yeah.
going to do better for our kids. So it may not be pretty,
Mm.
but it's what is better for our kids to be talking about it and to really be open. Like you said, I don't always want to hear everything that they have to say, right? I don't want to know. You're kind of inside, you're going, I don't want to know. Don't just keep that to yourself. But on the outside, we're going to stay calm and we're going to be willing to be open and like be that person for our kids so they can really come to us and consider us the expert and consider us their go-to person. And that's what I want more than anything.
So now you are running a marketing firm in Vancouver, moved, like you said, across the continent, maybe?
World.
Across the
Yeah.
world-ish. And where you are a wordsmith and storyteller who helps clarify, then amplify messages that matter. What is the message that matters now to you talking about sex or dating in those conversations?
Mm. Yeah, I think that what matters to me is doing anything I can to reverse some of the really unhealthy things that I think my books propagated in the past. And that includes conversations like this, where I'm trying to share, there's not one perfect path and one perfect outcome or story. You shouldn't feel pressured to do things a certain way. And that goes both ways. If my kids or other people I know want to wait until, a lifelong commitment of marriage to have sex, I applaud that. That's fantastic. But they should do that because they want that for themselves.
Mm.
And they should do that without the expectation that that means they're going to have a particular kind of sex life, or that God has promised them that everything will work smoothly and all those types of things. And the same goes for the person that wants to have sexual experiences with multiple people outside of marriage. I no longer judge and condemn that, or think that is completely unhealthy. And so I'm really just wanting to be a voice that's facilitating open conversation, respect of different viewpoints. And then I think the other thing that's really important for me, honestly, is trying to amplify the voices of women around this conversation, which is why I'm so excited that you are both leading in this way and serving in this way in the community that you're influencing, because a lot of what I wrote and then did as a pastor, I feel was often stifling of women and kept them from roles of leadership. Just the structures I was a part of did that in general. And I think that the unhealthiness of what we call purity culture now had a disproportionate impact on women.
Mm.
I think there's so much more shame and guilt and condemnation heaped on women, so much more pressure. The whole conversation around purity is so kind of ownership based. It's so misogynistic in some cases. I'm not saying that it's always that way from a Christian perspective, but just it takes on that tone. And there's such a massive double standard, even within families, the way they view their sons and their daughters, I think is really unhealthy. And so I'm really trying to give voices to people, specifically women, who are speaking to these things and really adding, I think, such important insights to the conversation.
I appreciate you saying that and acknowledging that. As with all the things that you've acknowledged and evolved and changed on, that's one I personally appreciate. So thank you for saying that. I do think that the purity movement disproportionately impacted women for a lot of reasons. And the ownership issue is really important. I remember one of our Sunday school teachers saying, my virginity was a gift I gave my husband, right? And it wasn't necessarily a gift he gave her, but it was about like giving something to your husband and that exchange and being pure for him. And there's a lot packed into those kinds of statements that relate to ownership. One of the first studies that I did as a PhD was interviewing people around our age and asking them how they were impacted by the True Love Waits movement. And I interviewed men and women, and I was very prepared for the impact on women. I had my own negative experiences with shame and guilt. I kind of knew what I was going into. I was actually shocked by the negative impact on men. And I remember I interviewed one man who was in ministry at that point, and he was married, and he had at 16 signed the True Love Waits pledge card, wore the ring, did all of that until he was married. He actually carried his pledge card in his wallet at all times. He had written his wife a letter, his future wife. So at 16, he had written his future wife, who he had not met, a letter talking about his purity. And then he met his wife, the woman who would be his wife. He gave her the letter, and it was very painful for her because she had not waited. And so then it's this thing you said about this promise. I don't want my kids if my kids want to wait, great. But I don't want them to wait because they think this promise is going to make them have this perfect, magical marriage with an amazing sex life, because that's not how it played out for so many people that we know, and men and women.
People.
And that was really interesting. The other piece for men that was really impactful for them and that I was surprised by was the amount of guilt they felt around masturbation. And it seems so obvious now, but at the time, so many of them talked about the way that the church talked about that, and the way that even just society outside of the church talks about that they felt so much guilt and shame around masturbation too.
Well, I was talking to a friend about this recently, and she was laughing at the fact that men's groups in churches, that the girls all know that the only thing they really talk about in those accountability groups is pornography and masturbation.
Yeah.
And it's like, she's saying, aren't there other like issues of spiritual growth and life that could be talked about? But there's such an intense focus and so much shame that's built around those issues that it's inevitable that you're going to develop and react to your sexuality in ways that are less than healthy when you have that kind of obsessive focus on something. I mean, you think about that in any area of your life. If you obsess that much about one small part of who you are as a human, you're going to be out of balance. If you think about exercise and you're obsessed with your calves and all you do is work out your calves, you're gonna look funny. Okay, There's just no way around that. You could say the same thing with health. I mean, whatever. It's just like it's an unhealthy structure, and it's so difficult though to break out of it. and I think you mentioned this earlier about the church not talking about things. Part of the reason it doesn't talk about things is because it will upset different wings of the church, of the base. It's hilarious to me. Oh gosh, I shouldn't get political, but let's pretend let's pretend that there was a large Christian university and that the president of that university did all types of unhelpful things, but actually the only thing that got that president fired was related to sex, was related to, having his pants unzipped, for example. Let's just imagine that scenario. You would just that's an example of how there's such an intense obsessive focus, and if you step out of line and you have, for example, back in the 90s, Jocelyn, what's her name? Jocelyn Elders, was she the Surgeon General at that time under Bill Clinton?
Uh-oh.
She actually suggested the idea that kids be taught about masturbation. And there was a firestorm response. Bill Clinton, not by any means a conservative favorite, he fired her because she did that, because there was such a reaction. Okay. So then think about your typical church. How can they have honest conversations about these things when they know it could affect their giving base? If they talk about, well, married couples should try these things in the bedroom, and or whatever, or talking to your kids about masturbation, that's normal. Or God forbid, let's have an honest conversation. 95% of our kids are going to have sex before marriage. So let's stop playing this game that acts like that's going to be some massive failure. And let's be honest, most of us are in that 95%. That kind of honest conversation would create a firestorm reaction in most churches. And that's why people's hands are tied. That's why the church is like, oh, well, the parents are going to do it, because they don't want to deal with that kind of backlash.
Yeah. It makes me so sad. And I think what that really says is that it's still saying sex is bad, right? Like, it's still saying if we can't talk about sex in the church between a husband and wife, then we're still saying sex is bad all these years later, right? Because not talking about it, and we say this with, parents. If the parents aren't talking about it, the message they're sending to their kids is sex is bad. It's something we don't talk about. We don't bring it up. It's taboo. And so we just aren't going to go there. And they think, well, at least I'm being quiet about it, so I haven't formed any values for my kid around it. Yes, you have. You're telling them that it's bad. And so the church being silent is doing the same thing. They're saying it's bad. We don't talk about it.
It's true.
So that's a bummer. We're going to change that.
You are changing that. I love it.
In I Kiss Dating Goodbye, you heard some hard truths like those that we just talked about, with having this dream of what marriage was going to be like and it not necessarily being that way, sexually at least. If you could help others rewrite their story, and that's a lot of what you're doing from a business perspective, but if you could help others rewrite their stories when it comes to their perspectives on sex and sexuality, how would their stories be different?
When you say rewrite their stories, you mean if they could go back and do things differently, or just moving forward in their life?
I think both. I mean, we can't go back and redo things. So maybe it is rewriting the story from now forward, which I think you personally have done a beautiful job of. It seems to me like the model of writing the story differently or rewriting the story. How do other people do that going forward too?
Well, it's such a messy process for me. I think that changing the way you think in any area, especially when there's cultural pressure around it, is so difficult, because you end up kind of going back and forth between fear and silence, and then wanting to break out of that. And then when you break out of that, you feel like you're coming on too strong, or you're out of balance, that type of thing. And, I had this interesting interaction with someone on Instagram where they were basically saying, because of things I was posting and because I was talking about sexuality and female sexuality and that type of thing, they were saying, you've swung from legalism to licentiousness. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, I can't totally say they're wrong. I mean, I think they have a point. But what I recognized was that part of what's been at work in my own life, and where I have to kind of be gentle with myself and patient just with myself, is that when you're trying to break out of old ingrained patterns of thinking, it's not just that you're swinging on a pendulum, but you're really trying to break something down.
Mm.
Like, even, you might say, I believe this now, but internally you still have all those old patterns, almost like walls that are
Mm.
still there. And it's tremendously difficult, and I'm talking to so many different people that are in a similar place as I am. And even though they are no longer adhering to the same ideas around purity culture and sexuality, boy, they still feel guilt, they still feel shame around
Mm.
things. And there's a process of self-talk and almost reparenting, self-parenting that's taking place. I mean, from a Christian viewpoint, you would talk about renewing your mind. Well, in a similar way, you have to kind of look at ways of thinking and say, okay, I used to think this and I used to assume this, but now I realize there's kind of a broader reality. And no, that's not completely true. And I now value this and I now think this. And that takes like repetition. You don't just do that one time. That involves conversation. So I mean, you are doing an amazing thing where you're helping parents talk to their children, but there's also this important place where parents need to be talking to themselves. They need to be having conversations with, whether it's books they're reading or other people that they can have these kind of open dialogues with, around disappointment in sex, around maybe the inability to be vocal about what they want in a sexual relationship. The tools that we have been given to talk about sex are so tied to not having sex.
Mm.
They're so weighted towards men, giving consent to men, whatever, that type of thing. And we don't have the sort of mental tools and then just language and speech tools to talk about, this is what I want sexually. This is what I want. That let's both now dialogue about what we both want sexually and what we're going to experience together. Like those types of conversations, and even just a relationship with yourself sexually, those are so radically different for a lot of people who have come from the same background I have. So I love the fact that there are so many voices out there that are trying to engage that and speak to that, and incredible women who are teaching and modeling by example, an owning of their sexuality, a celebration of their sexuality, separate even from men. It's not like I'm sexual if I'm around a man, or I'm sexual for the sake of a man, or I'm beautiful for the sake of a man, but who am I as a person individually, enjoying that and then bringing my own kind of confidence and sexual energy to another person, not to complete myself, but to increase my own experience and enjoyment. Those are radically different ways of thinking about things.
Yeah. When we first started the course, I think initially we thought, oh, it's going to be hard for them to share the facts. It's going to be hard for them to share. But that's actually been the easy part to explain, because the
Mm,
facts are the facts regardless of your values. But then the parents really have to step up and say, what are my values around this? And we tell them, we're like, we can't do this part
yeah,
for you. And it may take
yeah,
therapy. It may take time for you to be able to
yeah.
wrestle with the way that you were taught, or the baggage that you carry into this. And it may take time for you to really break down and identify truly what your values are and what you really want your kids to take away from
Hmm.
this. Is it
Hmm.
purity? I want my kid to be a virgin when they get married, whatever comes with that,
Hmm.
no. Or is it being able to make good decisions when you're not there, and being able to protect themselves when you're not there and not in their ear making choices for them, but being empowered and able to make good choices for themselves that limits and reduces that amount of shame and guilt that they feel years down the road. I mentioned earlier that, you know, you're watching your process unfold and seeing you kind of come full circle on this. I said that like I know you in real life, but watching your public process and going through this and coming full circle on it, I mentioned before, helped us to say, we're going to be open on this and we're not going to just say we're the authority and package this beautifully and promise that it's not going to be messy, you know? But I read a quote from you, and I'm hoping this is really from you. I checked in 2 different places. So, but you said you can have good intentions and think you're making good decisions, but the effect of people's lives can be very different than you'd planned. And so I just like to know how this mentality, from what you've learned from your experience with I Kiss Dating Goodbye, and then your experience with I Survived I Kiss Dating Goodbye, how that affects your work and your life today.
The self-confidence, the hubris of I Kiss Dating Goodbye, the book, was this idea that here's the right way to do things. And if you just try harder and do this, then you're going to experience God's best. And obviously, as a 21-year-old, I had no idea what the hell I was talking about. And so, it's hard for me because I can be tempted to just not say anything, not speak about any of these things. And I get that response from people who will communicate, why don't you just go away? Like you shouldn't have a platform. You shouldn't be saying anything. And I think there's an argument to be made there, you messed up and that kind of thing. But I really want to encourage a world where all different kinds of voices and perspectives are valued. And I think the answer for me is not that I stop speaking, but that I share my thoughts and perspectives and so on with an open-handedness that recognizes I'm not saying everybody else has to do this. I'm not saying it's the only way. And listening to other people along the way. So I think that's probably the biggest thing that has shaped things for me. And I do think that it's easy to duplicate some of the same problems in the church in secular contexts. In other words, you can become just as dogmatic about things. You can be just as controlling. I saw a cancel culture in the church, and there's obviously a cancel culture in the culture, and there needs to be in some cases when there's just behavior that is damaging and harmful and abusive. But there's also, I think, a place where we the only way that people are actually going to grow and learn and process is if there's an environment where we can have open conversation and dialogue around things and disagree and try to be civil.
We appreciate you being that voice.
Goodness,
Don't stop talking. I don't think people who have always gotten it right, which there's no human that's done that, are even the best people to give the full perspective. You bring a perspective that is unique and different, and that has you coming out with what you have in the more recent years helped us a lot. I mean, it made us feel validated about things that we knew and felt in ways that is really important. And not many people can be as open-minded, as willing to change their minds as you are. You're perfectly positioned to be one of the ones talking about it. I like that you're amplifying other voices, but to be one of the ones talking about it.
This is going to sound super weird, but I'm going to say it anyways.
Oh gosh.
I think it's on Netflix, The Black Mirror. Have either of you watched that before?
I have. I watched a few episodes, yeah.
Okay, so I think it was the second episode in the series, and Bryce Dallas was the main character, and everything they did was based on merits, and they would walk past somebody and they'd be given stars or points or something. And so her whole life was lived for those stars and those merits. And then she, at the end, meets this truck driver who lives outside of that and does her own thing. And I actually think that you're in a really cool place. Like, you're the truck driver who just doesn't live for the merits anymore. And you're like, it's a cool place to be, because most people are so in fear of being canceled. And now you're like, okay, some people have canceled me, but I'm not dead. I haven't gone away. And I actually I think it's cool. Again, your public transformation that you've shown people. I know there's a lot more underneath that, but what you've shown people, the person that they interviewed that you showed in the documentary, where they put you on the spot and they asked you to pray on like one of the Christian channels.
networks, yeah.
Yeah. And,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
seeing that version of yourself and then seeing now like what you represent on social media and, who you're putting out into the world, it's like I see so many more fruits of the spirit from this version of
Mm,
yourself. I see that patience and the love and really love, right? Like that's a transformation. Like the joy and the peace that you have. I see so much more of
mm.
that in your public self now than ever before. And so that's really cool. I just wanted to say that mostly to
That is
encourage
so
you.
encouraging. I'm like so blown away by that encouragement. It really means a lot to me. Thank you both.
We have to think about it. We can't just put it in the back of our minds and say, we know this is important, but it's too hard, so I'm not going to deal with it. We can't do that. We can't hide our heads in the sand anymore. And I feel like now when parents tell us that, like, we don't know how to do it, so we won't. And nobody else does it well either, so it's fine. We're like, hey, oh my word, we've got this. Like we can get you there, like let us walk alongside you. And the families that have trusted us so far, it's amazing to see the transformations they've made and how far they've come in the way that they're, in their mindset shifts. So
That's so important. I mean, it's incredible when you think about all the ways that parents will invest in their kids. I mean, how much do
yes,
parents spend on piano lessons?
yes,
How much do parents
baseball
spend
training. Yep.
on, yeah, all these different things. And here's this part of your child's life that is so important, is such an important part of their just being human and experiencing other people and their most important relationships. And the fact that we just avoid it or hope that they'll be fine is really so, I think, short-sighted. So
Yeah.
I love that you're helping to facilitate those important conversations.
Yeah, and the odds of them playing piano when they're adults is like 0, but the odds of them having
I
sex
know.
is close to 100%. So let's invest in the
Yeah,
right thing.
yeah. That's so true.
I love it.
That's true. Do you have sex now? I mean, I took lessons back when I was 12, but I don't really, it's like,
It's not for me.
yeah, it's not for me.
Oh my gosh, that's perfect.
I can play chopsticks.
That's so perfect.
Josh, thanks for being on the
Oh
show.
my gosh, yes.
We appreciate you
Oh,
so
it's
much.
so fun. Thank you for a great conversation.
As soon as we hang up, we're gonna do a little happy dance. So we're like super amped.
I really am honored to get to talk with you.
Tell us where people can find you and find your business. Tell us more about that real quick before we close out.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yeah, my business is called Clear and Loud, and you can find it at clearandloud.com online. And really what we do is we help businesses and organizations that are not being clear in the way they talk about their products. There's so much confusing messaging out there, and we help them create a clear strategy to express that. And then we build incredible websites for them and help them market and reach the audience they want to reach.
Yeah, it's so hard. We're glad you're helping businesses out there.
Yeah.
It's great.
I have a feeling our paths will cross again. I have a gut feeling that we'll cross paths again. So that's exciting.
I hope so. I hope so, for sure.
Yeah. Thanks for being on today.
Yes. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time.
Great to meet you, and just keep going. You're doing really good work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right. See you. Bye-bye.